Asked during the debate to name the security threats that worry him, Newt Gingrich lays out 3 scenarios: a weapon of mass destruction in an American city, a cyber attack, and something many have never heard of.
Electromagnetic pulse attack, which would literally destroy the country's capacity to function.
An electromagnetic pulse attack, or E.M.P. It's been the stuff of fiction on the Fox show 24.
It's an E.M.P!
But it's also a real threat, experts say, and it likely wouldn't look like that. An E.M.P. attack, they say, is an intense burst of electromagnetic radiation. It can be triggered by detonating a nuclear weapon at high altitude, a weapon that could be launched by a rogue nation or a terrorist group with access to it. Detonated low to the ground, atomic weapons have a devastating physical shock. But detonated miles up in the atmosphere, experts say, the main impact is electrical, energy that doesn't kill people but spreads like lightning, striking any electrical grid or circuitry, feeding into them, burning them out. Whole cities could go dark. Security analyst James Carafano has written about E.M.P. attacks.
In one single event, what could be disabled?
If you had a large-scale E.M.P. event in the United States, everything would be disabled, because even things that weren't knocked out, let's say your car, which might be okay, but the electrical grid's going to be gone. There's going to be no way to do traffic lights. There's going to be no way to land ships. There's no way to get fuel to the gas stations to refuel your car. And if you got them there, the gas pumps wouldn't work.
Think of this fictional attack in the movie Ocean's 11. We demonstrated electromagnetic interference on a much smaller, less threatening scale at the University of Maryland, showing how magnetic fields from some electronic devices often interfere with other devices.
You hear this ringing behind me? We're showing you what electromagnetic interference is. Say this television is a car. The car's function is rolling along normally. Here's a cell phone ringing. When it gets close to that, you can see how the audio of the television signal changes. You can hear the interference. That's essentially, it's interfering with the car's function.
But with a large-scale E.M.P. attack, experts say, computers would fail, telecommunications cut off, bank accounts inaccessible. They say that's because the transformers that power many electrical grids take a long time to manufacture and transport. And with transportation knocked out by the attack, that prolongs the isolation. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
Imagine you're home for the evening. You manage to grab a cup of tea, finishing up some last-minute work that you didn't quite get done at the office. And all of a sudden, the power goes out. It doesn't take long to realize that it's going to stay out. So you manage to grab a flashlight that you had nearby, and you go looking for those candles that your wife put away somewhere. And you manage to find some old candles, and you light them, and you set to wait for the power to come back on. But you thought, hey, let me see if I can contact someone, only to realize that your phone has no signal. Far-fetched? Could this happen? Well, according to the Department of Homeland Security, it could happen. And the likelihood of it happening is greater than we think. Based on this article that was released in September of 2020, the DHS continues to prepare against ever-evolving threats against the American homeland, most recently highlighting its efforts to combat an electromagnetic pulse, which could disrupt the electrical grid and potentially damage electronics. Today, the department is releasing its E.M.P. status report as a part of its update on efforts underway to support Executive Order 13865 on coordinating national resilience to EMPs. This report establishes resilience and security standards for U.S. critical infrastructure as a national priority. EMP weapons have the potential to disrupt unprotected critical infrastructure within the United States and could impact millions over large parts of the country. Since the President's signing of the executive order in March of 2019, the DHS, through the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, in accordance with the Science and Technology Directorate and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has taken key actions to address known EMP-related vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure. The EMP Program Status Report highlights efforts taken across the public and private sector to foster increased resilience to EMP events. Through data analysis, vulnerability and risk assessments, testing and pilot programs, and government and industry engagement, the department is identifying critical infrastructure and associated functions that are at greatest risk for an EMP and developing and implementing best practices to reduce the risk. EMP attacks are part of the emerging threats against our nation and demand a response, said senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli. That is why DHS is taking these contingencies very seriously, working diligently to mitigate our risks and equipping our state and local partners with the resources they need to do the same. We've made significant progress and look forward to the work ahead. Okay, I'll stop there with that article. Welcome back to the channel. I appreciate your being here. The discussion of an EMP attack is something that occurred to me to discuss with you. There are many on the channel and on other channels who are speaking of preparing for rough times ahead. But one of the things that's likely not being discussed as a possibility and even a likelihood is the power going out and staying out for some time. In the scenario created at the beginning of this video, that young man who experienced the power outage had no idea that the power would be out for quite some time. Weeks, months, a year. Was he prepared? Are you? Let's talk about that.
A nuclear EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, is the electric shock wave triggered by a nuclear blast. It has the ability to fry every single electronic circuit in its range, destroying most devices unless they're shielded. The higher the altitude a nuclear weapon detonates, the wider the effect is over its target. All right, so what does this mean? It means once an EMP goes off, everything affected by it goes dark, literally. A single nuclear bomb exploding high enough can destroy a country's ability to light its streets, power its hospitals, run its stock exchange, access the internet, or use a phone. Most trappings of the 21st century would simply stop working. No car or plane would move, no police officer or fireman could be called, no supermarket restocked. Modern life as we know it would simply cease to exist. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has threatened to do just this, to detonate a single nuclear weapon high up in the atmosphere above the United States. And while very little blast damage would be felt, more than 320 million Americans would suddenly find themselves fighting for survival, without power, without lights, and running out of food. Protection against this kind of attack is enormously expensive, the price tag running into the billions and not guaranteed to work. And although some exaggerated estimates claim up to 90% of Americans would die as a consequence, one thing's for sure, it would take months, if not years, for the country to fully recover.
According to the Independent Sentinel, the growing threat of an EMP could kill 90% of the population of this nation. It reads, "We haven't heard much about EMPs for some time, but our enemies are exploring a surprise EMP as a first option under Beijing's new Blitzkrieg strategy," according to Andrew Thornbrook at the Epoch Times. The risk of an EMP on U.S. infrastructure is very high, particularly in this international environment. Skipping forward, Forbes reported last year the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security issued a report on Beijing's ability to conduct an EMP attack on the U.S. Dr. Peter Pry, executive director of the task force, said that China now possesses super EMP weapons, knows how to protect itself from EMP attacks, and has gone far as to develop first strike protocols despite denials they would do so. On top of that, they have the most active ballistic missile development program in the world, according to the Center for Strategic International Studies, which makes the development involving EMPs even more troublesome. They have stolen U.S. technology in order to manufacture 3 types of high-tech weapons in order to attack the U.S. grid and other key technologies in what would be a Pearl Harbor style, which would be capable of blacking out the entire country, shutting down not only power plants, but disabling transportation, utilities such as water and sewer plants, communication, etc. In a 2017 statement by the EMP Commission, cited Ambassador Henry Cooper, former director of the U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative, who wrote that a high-altitude EMP blast could result in the shutdown of the U.S. electric grid for an indefinite period, leading to the death within a year of up to 90% of all Americans. Few Americans have any idea what it's like to live without electricity, constant digital communication, or immediate access to medical or transportation services, which can be taken away by EMP weapons, Fisher said. The damage of an EMP attack destroys anything with an electrical circuit, and that means electrical systems and infrastructures that we rely on as a society would no longer be intact, Kessler said. It would create societal chaos and unpreparedness in a society that would be transitioned back to a 19th century way of life. New concerns center around China's new hypersonic. They could hide an EMP mechanism at high altitudes. And that was according to the Independent Sentinel. A few years ago, back in 2017, this company called Deagle, they have since removed this article from their website, this information, but they released information where they projected population increases or decreases for the year 2025. And it was interesting that they projected significant reductions in population in certain nations throughout the world. If you look at the chart on the screen, you'll see their projection for the U.S. In 2017, they gave the population of the country in 2017. And if you look at the forecast for 2025, you'll see that they estimate that population to be significantly less than it was in 2017. That's a 70% reduction in population. 70%. That is very similar to the number given to us in the previous article of 90% reduction. Could it be that this threat is the mechanism by which powers that be could bring forth an NWO? Could it be? In one fell swoop, this kind of EMP could take out the power, take out the water, take out banking, take out all infrastructure, and make the citizenry completely dependent on governments for its food, its water, its protection, its sustenance. Not to mention the rioting that would ensue as a result of people desperate for resources, clamoring to find it. It's something to consider. On this next slide, you can see some of the projections for certain other nations. Notice that there's slightly any reduction in the nation listed first. And then you see others in Europe who suffer a similar fate, according to these projections. Could it be that this is all a part of the judgment that's to come to the European nations that's been spoken of by the scriptures? Very well could be. Very well could be. Very few people understand the lengths and the breadth of how the world would change if there was no power, if there was no digital infrastructure to which we have all become accustomed. We become accustomed to the convenience of getting on the phone and ordering your dinner and having it delivered, or having your groceries delivered, or just taking something out of your freezer and popping it in the microwave and heating it up when you don't feel like cooking. We have become accustomed to these conveniences. And imagine if they were no longer there. Imagine if you managed to have some food in your house or in your freezer, knowing that with an extended power outage, that food would likely begin to rot and would serve you no useful purpose. In your preparations, have you considered the possibility of the power going out and staying out for quite some time? Are your preparations involving supplies that need no refrigeration? You should consider that. Are your preparations including water? Because in a situation such as we've described, no water would come from the tap. These are things that need to be considered. Take a look at the trailer for this movie that came out recently.
So, why are we doing this again?
I just want you to be familiar with it. Just in case things go bad one day. Probably won't. But it's possible.
I'm alone. It's been 10 days since the EMP. That means electromagnetic pulse. Nothing works, except for some old flashlights. Dad told me it could happen one day. I don't know where he is. Things are crazy outside. He knew this would happen. He's supposed to be here with me. I hope he's okay.
When do you think the power will come back on?
It won't. Everything's fried.
So there's no help. Well then, we're a team. Hey, check this out.
It's not supposed to work.
If separated, go here and wait for me.
Will!
Frightening, isn't it? Just the concept of those who have not prepared seeking to take from those who have, in addition to the concern of not being prepared at all and being one of those ones who are desperate for resources and willing to do anything in order to get them. According to Off the Grid News, in the aftermath of an EMP, what would it take to survive? A major solar storm would do similar damage to America and the world, and actually did so in 1859 during what is known as the Carrington event. It destroyed telegraph machines, the most advanced technology of the time. Although the Earth has dodged similar solar storms since then, a Carrington solar-like blast nearly hit Earth in 2012. Within seconds of either an EMP or major solar storm, all solid-state electronics and computer-controlled devices will cease working forever. However, that's not to say that all electronic devices will die. Surprisingly, simple electronics will survive, although there won't be any power to make them operate. Pretty much all of the infrastructure we depend upon will be destroyed. Airplanes will fall out of the sky mid-flight. Gas pumps will stop working. The entire electrical power grid will go down. Most of us will be without water, as the pumps and water treatment plants won't have the electrical energy they need to purify the water and get the water to us. All commerce will be on a cash-only basis at first, eventually morphing into a barter system. One of the surprising things that will survive an EMP is solar panels. While the EMP will reduce their efficiency somewhat, it won't really be enough to make much of a difference. Electric motors will function too, so wind generators will still work and appliances may still be usable. Of course, with the grid down, the only way they would be usable is if you have solar panels or a wind turbine to produce power. The people who will be the best off after an EMP will be those who live in rural communities, especially rural farming communities. They will have food available to them, even though transporting that food to the cities will be almost impossible. We will see people dying off from the very beginning. There are a large number of people who depend upon medicines to keep them alive. Without the ability to distribute the medicines, many of these people will pass away once their personal supply of medicine runs out. The big killers in this aftermath of an EMP will be starvation and hypothermia. This will be the second wave of deaths from the EMP, and it will be so enormous that it will make the first wave pale by comparison. Without the ability to transport supplies, cities will become death camps. Those who can't escape the city will eventually have a better chance than those who stay behind. Of course, people who have a food stockpile will have a much better chance of survival. What can you do? Preparing for an EMP is just like preparing for any other disaster, with one major difference, that is, there will be no turning back. As things stand right now, an EMP or a major solar storm will be so devastating that it will take decades to recover, not just years. You can count on a year's worth of food getting you through the aftermath of an EMP. About the only way you can be sure of surviving is to turn your home into a homestead. You'll need to produce your own food in order to survive. That means an extensive vegetable garden, as well as raising chickens and other animals for eggs and meat. You will need to produce enough to feed your family for a whole year, not just to make it through a few months. The ability to produce your own electricity could help as well, but only if you have electronic devices hidden away in a Faraday cage. Make sure you have a spare charger for your battery backup and a spare voltage inverter as well. Otherwise, those solar panels won't do a bit of good. And that's according to Off the Grid News. So, reading this, has it made you rethink your preps? Has it made you rethink the things that you need to do in order to prepare for what's coming? If it's not an EMP attack, then it will be a solar eruption. One of those things. Either will produce a similar effect. Either one of those things. Whether it's contrived or whether or not it's accidental, whichever, it's going to produce the same results. And the Deagle.com projections are frightening to say the least, and curious as well. Where did they come up with those projections? How do they know that by 2025, the populations of the world would be reduced to such a degree? Do they have insider information? Have they been reading the scriptures? It makes you wonder. But regardless of all of this, your job is to prepare as much as you can and be thinking about life without power for an extended period of time, and allow that to drive your preparations. What would life really be like after an EMP? Would an EMP really be that bad? How would life change for you? Yes, it really would be that bad. Today's society is totally unprepared to live in an environment akin to the 19th century. There are 3 specific consequences of an EMP that we will discuss here to establish how life would change for you. Consequence 1. The power grid really would be down. An EMP would either take down a large portion of our nation's power grid or the entire grid as a whole. Most of your electronics would not work, including your television, computers, tablets, phones, and cars. The only cars that would work in a large-scale EMP are a few models made before 1990, such as the Toyota, truck, Chevy Blazer, Ford Bronco, and a few other models of Jeeps and Land Rovers. You could expect long-term outages to last for several months, if not years. Estimates are that it would take the U.S. a good decade at a bare minimum to remotely recover from an EMP. Because most of our electronic equipment is produced overseas, the damaged power transformers would take several years to be repaired. There would also be no more electronic payments, and you would be unable to access the money in your bank account. You need to have cash on hand, which, as we discussed previously, is going to lose value, so it would be advisable to spend as much of it as you can on supplies and necessities in the hours after an EMP. And I would add, in the days, weeks, and months before it, meaning the time is now. Continuing, my advice would be to have a cash emergency fund consisting of at least $1,000 in your home at all times. Consequence 2, there will be chaos in the streets. Once people realize what's going on, there would be panic on a mass scale. The first 24 hours to 72 hours after the EMP would be the worst. There would be a massive spike in crime, including invasions and robberies. Rioting would take place in the streets as people form angry mobs and set fire to buildings and public establishments. Eventually, rioting would die down after a few days, but the home and robberies would never cease. Your best bet to stay alive would be to keep yourself locked in your home rather than venturing outside. Put your security plan, step 3, into action. Consequence number 3, martial law will be declared. Finally, the third consequence of an EMP is that the federal or state government, or both, would declare martial law, which means that your rights would be suspended as the government takes control. The government would begin to confiscate firearms just like they did after Hurricane Katrina, and there would be a nationwide curfew and heavy restrictions on travel. The government may also go door to door to confiscate food and then redistribute it around the population to ration it. The idea is that the authorities would want to make the population dependent on them, and long food and water lines would occur to create that dependence. You can therefore fully expect National Guard soldiers or police to come to your home and take whatever they choose. My advice would be to leave some of your food out in the open in an easy-to-find place so they'll be satisfied with taking that, but leave the bulk of your food and water storage in places that are much harder to find, such as a secret room or under floorboards in your basement. You won't be able to trust any media sources as the government will take control of them, i.e., don't trust your daily newspaper. Martial law is an entirely separate subject and one that you should definitely research if you have not already. For now, just know that it means that you would no longer have freedom of speech or assembly. Much of your supplies and all of your that the government knows you have would be confiscated. The government would be transmitting false information through the media. Checkpoints would be set up through your city, and the government would attempt to make people dependent on them through confiscating of the food and creating food lines. Again, that is why forming a survival group is important, so you can turn to other people for resources and help. The old saying goes that there is safety in numbers, and this could not be any more true in the case of an EMP. Okay, that was according to Outdoor Revival, and they bring up some interesting points there in that article. Some things may need to be considered, other things maybe not. So we would all need to consult in prayer the Father regarding how we are to prepare. Having resources available is a key thing, but also being able to protect those resources is also a key thing. So I would recommend prayer. I would recommend asking the Father how best to prepare and how best to protect. Okay, and ask also for protection from the Father for yourself, your family, your location where you are dwelling, and for those whom He has decided to perhaps bring into your fold to have you help them, because that could be a possibility as well. I wanted to do this video because preparation is key. Preparation needs to be happening now. And some of you have made your preparations, and that is wonderful, but you need to be thinking, how would I survive in the event of long-term power outage? It changes everything, so that your supplies need to be really geared toward things that are shelf stable, things that don't necessarily require refrigeration or being in the freezer. Canning is recommended. It's a way to take what you have stored in your freezer and preserve it on the shelf for long-term use. So, thank you for considering what you've heard, and I pray that you would be in prayer about how best to prepare for the troubling times that are here and that are on the horizon.